Hello? Mute your. Okay. Mic check. I think it's working here. Right. Hello. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll get started. So my name is Anjali Field. I'm a professor here in the computer science department. I work unsurprisingly on NLP, but what I focus on within that is ethics and social science. So I'm going to talk about some of that work today, which I hope will be interesting and relevant for the projects that some of you are doing here this summer. So I'm going to start with a little bit of overview of what I'm planning to cover today. What do I want you to get out of this talk? I want you to get a sense of some of the types of analysis that researchers do with social media data. So hopefully that's pretty explanatory. I also want you to get a little bit of sense of some of the methods that people use in this domain. Not going to go a ton of depth in any one method because I'm trying to cover kind of more of a broad viewpoint, but I want you to get a sense of that actually there's really sort of a broad range of technical challenges here and a lot of kind of opportunities for innovation in that side. And then when we get to the end, I'll show you the overview in a minute, but I'm going to talk about some of the ethical challenges of doing research in this space. So this is a little bit general to doing research in NLP. We'll focus kind of on the social media side for today, but I think that this is something useful to have some practice in and thinking through some of the ethics of this work. So this is the overview of what I'm actually going to do. We're going to start by talking about some definitions, just what do I mean by text analysis. I'll go through kind of 3 examples, mostly giving examples based on applications, but sort of organized in a methods-driven way, and then we'll kind of wrap up by talking about ethics. Okay, so what do I mean by text analysis? Well, a lot of times, when we're working with these sort of more analysis or more kind of society and social media oriented settings, a real goal in these projects is to be able to learn something about society or social phenomena. This is a quote about kind of defining this space of computational social science. This is from a paper by Hannah Wallach, which I really like as a definition for this space, which is the study of social phenomena using digitized information and computational and statistical methods. So why am I spending some time on this? Well, when we think about a lot of the kind of more classic NLP problems and the way that we might think about these problems from more of a social science perspective or more of an analysis-driven perspective, you'll see some differences. So I'll do this by giving a couple of examples. First, kind of as an example, on the NLP side, a task that we might try to do is maybe we want to be able to do product recommendation, and we want to recommend relevant products to people on Amazon. On the social science side, we'd probably be less interested in actually making those recommendations, but what we might be interested in is examining to what extent recommendations affect shopping patterns versus other kinds of factors. As another example, an NLP task might be to predict which candidates are going to get hired for a job based on their resume. Where on the social science side, maybe we would analyze the impact of gender and race on the US hiring system. And then as a third example, on the NLP side, maybe we want to predict how many senators will vote for a proposed bill. And on the social science side, we'd be more interested in understanding when and why senators might deviate from their party ideologies. So if we look at these examples, one of the kind of common themes here is on the social science side, we often care more about explanation. We're interested in understanding phenomena. And on the NLP side, we're trying to do prediction. I'm going to broaden this a little bit more and say, really, maybe we're trying to do task automation. I think it's a little too narrow to just call it prediction all the time, especially in this large language model era. But there's sort of different goals here, even if sometimes we're using the same methods. So how do we actually do this? What are the methods that we do for this kind of more explanation-driven work? And on the left here, what I have is a taxonomy from a paper that was written by 2 social scientists about 10 years ago. So some of it has aged better than others. But what I like about this work is that 1, it's actually from the social science perspective, and 2, they give a kind of nice taxonomy of some of the methods that people use in this space. And I think some of these, sort of translate. So the ones that I'm going to focus on today, I'm going to give an example of using a supervised approach for this kind of task. I'll give an example of using an unsupervised approach for this kind of task. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about leveraging pre-trained representation. So this is sort of newer era in the world of embedding some language models. All right, so starting with this example of a supervised approach. I'm going to start by defining the kind of example that I'm going to use as an example in this space, and then we'll kind of go back to the method side, well, in a little bit. So hopefully everyone here is familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. So this was the actual term Black Lives Matter was coined by two activists in 2013, but it rose greatly in popularity in the summer of 2020 following the death of George Floyd. And in this time, and particularly in that summer of 2020, there were millions of tweets posted every day using hashtags like Black Lives Matter, Justice for George Floyd, and I Can't Breathe. So this was a movement where social media was really integral part of the movement. A lot of this movement kind of played out on social media, and that started even kind of early back in 2014, but really especially kind of in that summer of 2020. So this was a hugely influential movement. And when we look at something like this and we want to maybe understand something about this movement, it seems like text analysis is going to be really important here. We want to be able to do something with the social media data that was relevant here. And when we start thinking about like what might be interesting to look at in this data, what are the kinds of questions that we might want to study here, we can start by going back to some of the existing work on social movements in psychology and sociology. And when we look through some of this literature, some of the things that we'll see is there's a lot of interest in understanding what actually motivates social movement, what gets people to be involved, what makes a movement successful, what gets people to continue staying involved once they start. And one of the theories here is that there's this idea that what are called moral shocks. So this is something that people find kind of like shocking, that incite outrage and anger, or what often incites people to join a movement to begin with. But that movements have to have some more positive emotions. There has to be optimism, there has to be hope for change in order for people to stay involved. If the movement is all just kind of about outrage, then there's no longevity and people will just kind of give up and say this is hopeless. You need some kind of more positive emotions as well. And this has come out of a variety of studies that have proposed this kind of model. And how have they come up with it? In a couple of ways, but one of the main methods is through doing some qualitative interview studies. Like we actually just go to people who have been part of these movements and we ask them, why did you get involved? Why did you stay involved? And we can do this through interview studies. And some of this is going as far back as like civil rights movements. So this is useful. This gets really kind of in-depth, a really deep approach to looking at these kinds of questions, but it's potentially a little bit limited in scope. You're limited by how many people you can talk to. And social movements don't look the same way today that they did, a couple decades ago. So how might this have changed in this sort of era of online social movements? Well, we can study this, and how can we do this? We can go and collect data, and then we can analyze the emotions that are expressed in that data, and we can see if we find the same sort of patterns that people have seen in previous movements. Okay, so let's do that. So we start by pulling tweets about Black Lives Matter protests from this summer of 2020. This is the volume of tweets in the data set that I'm talking about. So you can see there's a huge kind of initial peak of tweets, and then it sort of slowly drifts downwards over the course of the summer. This covers about 6 weeks of data. You have one of the kind of challenges in this sort of work is we need to figure out what to actually include in the data set. So if we only collect tweets that have the hashtag Black Lives Matter, then we're missing a lot of data, right? There were many other hashtags that people posted, used to post about these movements, and so we have to kind of collect, figure out what are the right terms to collect. So that when we're starting on a research project in this space, one of the early questions is just, are you collecting the right data? So we pull a bunch of terms, pro-Black Lives Matter hashtags. We include terms that are more likely to be used by people who are opposed to the movement, and then terms that sort of generally refer to protests and police that weren't necessarily hashtags. All right, so I said we're going to use a supervised approach here. So what does a supervised pipeline look like? Well, we'll take some small amount of this data set and we annotate it by hand. We use that to train a machine learning model. And then we evaluate how well that model performs. And in this case, what we're interested in looking at is what emotions are expressed in that data. So we annotate for emotion types, we train the model to predict emotion types, and then we can estimate how well the model performs on identifying whether or not each of these emotions is expressed in a particular tweet. And then we use our model to label the full data set with expressed emotions, and then we can analyze those trends. So I'm not really going into the details of modeling here. I just think that like this is probably a fairly, I don't know, everyone's probably seen this before. We're just training supervised classifier, nothing complicated here. Yeah, we can do some variations of exactly which model we use. How does it compare against other models? What happens when we add more data? Sure, but you know, we're training classifier. Okay, so the supervised approach.
Find F1, I don't actually think it's come up in the summer school yet.
Oh, sure. So F1 is a metric that, yeah. So this is a metric that we can use to estimate the performance of a classification model. And the reason that you would use, so what F1 is specifically measuring is the balance between precision and recall, where precision is of everything that you're like of everything that your model labeled as containing a particular category, how many of those were actually right, and recall is of all of the things that have this category, how many was your model able to find. And the main reason that in something like this you would report F1 instead of accuracy is because emotions are, well, I'll show you the results in a minute, but they're a little bit sparse in the data. And so if you just look at accuracy, if your model predicts that no tweets contain fear, it'll get like 98% accuracy because fear is pretty rare in the data. But when you actually try to look at this balance of how many of these sort of fear tweets does your model capture, then you can really get a better sense of how the model's performing. Yeah, do you have a question? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you say it again?
Kind of also apply to other general kinds of social, like how do you specifically know that that would be the interest of this?
Yeah. Sorry?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the question was, we're collecting tweets that contain like some terms here that look pretty generic, like cops and protests. And so how do we filter out data that might contain these words, but that's not actually about the Black Lives Matter movement? So in this work, we actually don't really do this. It is, so we did some checks over the data of pulling through with the terms that we collected. We just like look at the tweets and say like, is the vast majority of data with this terms about the movement that we care about. There were a couple of terms that we pulled data for that we ended up discarding because they weren't related enough. But just the timing of these events was such that like the vast majority of the data using the word protest during that particular month was talking about the Black Lives Matter protest. So we just sort of trust like the volume of data to deal with some of the noise that might be happening. There was in early on, if I'm remembering right, I think in the first day or two of data, there are some, so this was also, there were like protests in Hong Kong just before these events. So in the first day or two of data, you do capture some of the like data talking about the Hong Kong protests, but then like by, May 27th, it's just totally flooded by Black Lives Matter data. Thought was there another question?
It's like, there's this like genetic noise that you get, but the thing that you're interested in is so much stronger compared to the noise that you're getting.
Yeah, and I'll show you too, like when we're looking at when we pull up the results, like we're looking at like pretty big differences here. We're not like focusing on, oh, like there's this little blip here. No, it's like this is huge, and so it's we can kind of leave let there be a little bit of noise without it being a big problem. Yeah. There are more questions? Okay. So this is the output of this pipeline. So we take the model, we infer emotion labels over the full data set. And then what I'm showing you is the percent of tweets as estimated by the model that contain each emotion over time, so over each day of the data set. And when we look at this chart, like there's a couple of things that I think are pretty interesting. So one, we do see this initial peak in anger. And so that is like in the first day or two, the most commonly expressed emotion as measured by our model. But then it sort of drops off. And it goes down and like maybe a little bit, maybe goes up a little bit more, but really kind of sort of drops off and plateaus. Whereas in contrast, we see this rise in more positive emotions that happens like a little bit later. And so this is sort of consistent with this idea of moral shocks, that maybe the first investment is coming out of anger and outrage, but that over time you see a lot of the importance of these kind of more positive emotions. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I mean, it's such a different population than the original, I mean, maybe it's not, but the original interviews that you talked about were people who have got out of bed.
Yeah.
And these are people who are participating online.
Yeah, there's been a couple of studies too that have done, like have sort of merged those. So they've looked at people who were active on Twitter and they did interview studies with them and like how those people were also involved in in-person protests. So yeah, there's been some work that's kind of tried to merge them a little bit too. Yeah, but it's very interesting. You have a question?
Yeah, what's wondering what the date is.
Yeah. Anyone want to guess? Yeah, it's Juneteenth. Yeah, it's actually on the 19th. It's a little hard to read here. Yeah, so this holiday to celebrate the end of slavery. So there's this big peak in like positive emotions being expressed. I think I haven't, oh no. Okay, I thought I had an arrow for it, but I don't. But nice observation.
How do you deal with sarcasm?
Yeah, so that is right. How do you deal with sarcasm? Was a question. So that is one of, did I put surprise on here? I did put surprise on here. So there is some level of sarcasm in the data. Based on our annotations, it's not super high. The main factor where we think it comes into play is when we look at how much annotators agreed over these emotions. Agreement is pretty high for most of them, except it's really low for surprise. And we think that a lot of that is was getting driven by some people labeling sarcasm. So these are, I didn't go into a ton of depth on the emotion taxonomy here, but these are all sort of higher level categories of emotion. So anger is really meant to capture like also outrage and both like, I don't know, someone being mad, but also someone being frustrated. And so that's all kind of gets grouped into one category. So surprise really captures both like surprise, but also confusion and realization. And a lot of people marked, some annotators considered sarcasm as one of those emotions, and some didn't. Like, if you're being sarcastic, you're expressing like some level of confusion or questioning. And so that's like one of the places where I think we see it in the data. So we didn't really do a ton of how to handle it here, but we also didn't draw any conclusions out of surprise because we didn't think that data was reliable.
The expected address audience also with effects, because if you hashtag Black Lives Matter, I'm thinking to be addressing a more public, making a more public address versus you don't have and just put police or protesting your own post and expect people that around you to be able to see. With that kind of differentiation of who the expected audience see of the
Yeah, so to repeat the question, it was how does the sort of expected audience of a tweet potentially change the emotions that are expected? And maybe one way to capture that is through the hashtags used in the tweets. That's a great question. It's likely that there is some influence of the audience. And one of the statements that we sort of assumed in this work is that anything that someone's posting on Twitter, they are doing because they're posting it publicly. Like, these aren't real emotions necessarily, right? They're what someone wants other people to see, whether that be a broad audience or like just their own circle. And so I think that does kind of shape how to think about these results a little bit. One of the other factors here is I don't think I put them in this presentation. No, I didn't. We did some breakdowns by hashtags, like which emotions were expressed more in hashtags in tweets that used Black Lives Matter hashtags or anti-Black Lives Matter hashtags or generally police and protest. And you do see some difference in the emotions there. Some of that we think is probably getting driven more by kind of stance necessarily than who the audience is, more like the user stance. Yeah, but that's a great question. It's quite hard to do some of these ideal analyses because like you don't really know who someone's target audience is. Yeah. Okay. Mhm.
Maybe just one question. So have you done some analysis according to, let's say, the view of US people versus European people? Say?
Not in this work. And I think we only looked at English data here. Yeah.
That just personally would be interesting to be like.
Yeah, so we did look at yeah, let me come back to that. Yeah, I'll say another sentence on that in a moment. Are there any other questions here? So there's one other thing that I wanted to point out about this slide, and I sort of already clicked through it already, so I kind of gave you the answer. But one of the things I think is really interesting here is like there's really low levels of expressions of sadness and surprise, and also fear. That fear is a little bit different too, but that seems like maybe a little bit surprising. Like you might sort of expect to see more sadness in a movement like this. And I think this is maybe one of the places where what we're capturing is that these are what people choose to advertise on Twitter. Like even the act of posting on Twitter at all is a sort of proactive action. And so if someone's kind of real response here is sadness, like they may not be on Twitter at all. So that's like a little bit speculating, but I think it goes to show some of the ways that we need to be careful and what kind of conclusions we can actually draw here. All right, so you asked about like differences geographically. We didn't really look at that across countries, but we did look at that within the US. And specifically, so some of the open question here is we can look at these things on Twitter, but this movement wasn't just online, there were also in-person protests. And so what were the kind of relationships between the online and the offline protests? So this is a chart that's showing, this line here is the tweet count, but the other line, the blue line, is the count of protests over time. And what you can see is that it's sort of similar to the tweet data, like there's initial kind of peak. The sort of real peak is actually after the peak on Twitter, which is itself kind of interesting. And then it goes down over time with like a couple more peaks. So the data is like not super smooth, you get these sort of peaks. So what do you think is happening here? Like what are these peaks? This is number of protests in the US. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of tweeting about protests and like potentially maybe Twitter getting people to go to protests, but that can't quite draw that conclusion here. But okay, so maybe it'll help to think about how far apart these peaks are. So the first one is like June 5th, and then we have like June 12th, and then about June 19th. Yeah, there are weekends. Yeah, protests are on weekends, right? So like people don't go to protests during the week. They're at school, they have jobs, like so all the protests happen on weekends. So when we start saying like, well, maybe we want to look at the relationship between what happened on Twitter and what happened and in like in-person protests, we have to do something about these weekends, right? Like we can't just look at a temporal correlation here. It doesn't make any sense. You have a question? Yeah, yeah, that could be. That could be what's happening. Yeah, well, like you could imagine like maybe someone who's really proactive on the weekend, they're not on Twitter because they're out in person, but in the week when they're at work and they like can't be doing what they actually think is important, then they're just like on Twitter. Yeah, I think actually what you see, there's a lot of the data that's talking about various protests. So there's a lot of like planning, and then after an event, like people share photos and stuff. And so I think that's some of why you see they're not simultaneous, like they're quite related. Yeah, so it doesn't really make sense to look at like temporal trends in this data. So if we had like a year's worth of data, maybe We could probably try to do something like separate out weekends and look at weekends separately from weekdays and try to take into account this fact that like we're going to have this variable we have to account for. We can do some more like, I don't know, time series modeling, whatever. But really, like, we don't really have a long enough time frame of data to do that. If we try to only look at the weekends, we end up with like 4 data points. So it doesn't really make sense. But one of the things that we can do with this data is to look geographically. So do we see a higher volume of protests in US cities and states where there were more of, and in this case, what we focus on is positive emotions expressed on social media. And this is going to this idea that like positivity is really important for getting people involved. And so when we do this, we do see these kinds of correlations that in US states and cities that had higher volume of online data, that had more positivity expressed on social media, there were also more in-person protests. And on the other hand, there's the opposite correlation for anger in US cities and states where there was more kind of anger expressed online, there was lower volume of in-person protests.
So star here means statistically significant?
Yeah.
And you highlighted the ones in red that you were most interested in.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
So you can say like people are motivated to create the protests without like motivated not by anger.
So like I would hesitate to draw a kind of causal conclusion here. Like we can say that they're correlated, and we can say that in cities and states where there was more protests, there was also more online positivity. One of the things that we are not getting at all from this data is which direction is that? Like, was there more positivity online and that encouraged people to protest in person? Or is it the act of protesting creates a lot of solidarity and leads to more positivity online? It could be either of those.
Overall in urban areas than like across states. You have like a hypothesis for why that is.
Yeah, the city data is very messy. So like the way that we do this is we go through users on Twitter and we try to associate them with US cities or states. And we do this if they've specified in their profile city or state. So that's also kind of another caveat here. Like we can't conclude this person was actually in this state when they posted it. It's that they have some association with the state. Anyone who put a city, like sort of by definition, also put a state. So that means more people put states. So we were able to identify like state level data for more users than for the city level data. And then the city level data, like some of the cities had, I think discarded cities that had fewer than, I don't remember the exact cutoff, like a few hundred people. But it does mean some of the cities, like if we identified 10 people listed this city in their profile, like that's going to be really messy data, right? That's not enough to kind of like deal with some of the sort of noise we might get. Okay, so what are some of the takeaways from this work? Well, we can draw from the kind of broad idea is that we can draw from existing social science theory to understand what to look for and how to measure it. So we started talking about the concept of moral shocks, this idea of emotions, because this was based on the relevant social science literature. I didn't really go into this as well, but even when we think about like how do we define emotion, why do we focus on anger, like that's drawing from social science theory as well. There's a lot of decisions here around how to process the data. So things like which hashtags and keywords do we conclude? How is that going to change the type of results that we can draw? And being careful about what we can and can't conclude. So that's one of the kind of big challenges in this space as well. And some of the other things that I think are important is that we really need to know the data set well. We need to know what are the relevant properties. So this things like protests only occur on weekends. If we hadn't sat down and looked at the protest data, we would have just tried to compute like temporal correlations and probably gotten some numbers and they wouldn't have made any sense, but we wouldn't have known that because we didn't actually look at the data.
Did the classifier, do the sentiment classifiers look at keywords when you mentioned keywords? Or were you talking about for data collection?
I was talking about data collection. We were using like the main model. This was like a Roberta-based model. We also ran some more keyword-based models just like for comparison.
LWIC, which I guess.
Yeah. some of that,
did much worse.
yeah.
It's done some-
Yeah, some of that is thinking about the audience of this kind of work that like psychologists know LIWC, and so they use it all the time, and so that's a baseline they want to see. Yeah, like NLP conference, you don't need that.
Right, this is how people used to measure emotion in text, and it just works much better with modern neural nets.
Yeah, but you'll still find it, like psychologists still use it. Yeah.
So the moral shocks theory seems very interesting. I'm wondering if there are other theories out there that are worth knowing about, especially on this online setting.
Yeah, there are on the online setting, I'd have to think harder. Just that work is newer. There certainly are other theories. I think on the emotion side, this is probably one of the most prominent ones. There are other kind of theories around emotions that we didn't really look at here. So there's also been, so I said like, I pointed out that there's like low level of sadness. So there's some theory, like what we focus on here is what gets people involved in movements. But you can also look at what gets people like out of movements. And so that's like one of the ideas that if there's a lot of emphasis on like sadness, then that's like very discouraging. And so people will kind of stop participating, that it's seen as like a more passive emotion, or encouraging more passiveness. So that's like one of the kind of other ones. Some of that came out of some of the same work that's looked at these sort of moral shock ideas. And then there's some deeper analysis on like finer grained emotion. So I just talked about anger, but some people have looked separately at kind of like disgust as being a combination of anger and outrage. And so all of our data like disgust and anger are very correlated. And some of that makes sense based on the theories of like how these emotions manifest in social movements. Yeah, there's others, yeah. I'm sure a psychologist could tell you more. You have a question?
So what do people prefer? Probably you have these statistics. Do they prefer using Twitter, for example, or any kind of written social media, or they prefer talking about these topics?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm doing a bad job of repeating the question. So the question was, do people prefer like Twitter when talking about these kinds of topics, or do they prefer actually talking about them? I'm not sure actually. Yeah, I don't in this data, like we don't really have that in this data because we are just looking at Twitter. Some of the studies that have tried to do that have done like more interview based, they like the people that they've talked to usually see these things as working together. That's like, you know, you're planning an event, you want people to show up, so you advertise on social media. And so there's sometimes like a lot of intentionality. There's a lot of, one of the things that's really interesting, there's a lot of like kind of behind the scenes planning that people will do. Like someone posts something and they'll like coordinate, like, okay, we want to advertise this thing, so we all independently share this at the same time, and then like I'll reshare yours and whatever. And so I think there's sort of a lot of like, I don't know that people who are really active in this space necessarily have like preference one way or the other, rather than they like see them working together. Yeah, I'm sure it depends on the person too. Okay, we're probably going to skip around a little bit today, which is fine. But I'll go ahead and go into kind of the next segment here, which is, so what we were looking at here, we did talked a lot about in depth about the data and the analysis, but ultimately the underlying method here was the supervised classifier. I'm going to give an example now of a place where maybe we don't want to use a supervised classifier, and we might prefer to kind of learn patterns more naturally from the data. And the example I'm going to give about this is looking at information posted on social media, particularly by media companies or like newspapers about the Russia-Ukraine war. Okay, so why might we want unsupervised approaches? So as I'm sure everyone knows, there's ongoing military conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine that started a couple of years ago. And alongside the actual warfare, there's been a lot of use of propaganda and attempts by both sides to control the narrative of the war, or more generally, manipulate information. And when we think about these events, This is again a case where we have online data as being something that's very important, that social media is something that people pay attention to, and also a place where we've seen these types of information manipulation strategies before. So information manipulation on social media isn't new to this event. This predates this and has something that has been going on for the last decade or so. So if we want to study information manipulation strategies around an event like this, again, we kind of start by collecting data. And here, potentially, we may want to collect data between before the war started and actually during the war. We also want to think carefully about which platforms are actually relevant to study here. So we collected data from Twitter, but we also collected data from VK, which is like basically the Russian version of Facebook, and it's a much more popular social media platform in Russia than things like Twitter. And we also care about collecting data from media outlets that are sort of actively state affiliated versus more independent. If we're looking at information manipulation, like this is sort of the dimension that we care about, like what outlets here might be kind of following the government narrative. So this was not collecting data based off of like random keywords the way the previous study was. This was looking, what are these various news outlets posting on these platforms and pulling posts made by these news outlets.
What about the Russian Facebook? You save contact there, but it's then let's go Telegram. Okay, so this is like a Twitter.
But Telegram is more like uncensored and they're more violent.
Yeah, isn't Telegram more private messaging?
I don't know. I just read the news that
you can like
Medvedev has said on Telegram, Medvedev written on Telegram, and everything I read is from Telegram. So
you can like read someone's blog or something. It's not as interactive as the other. Like you cannot really directly comment on most of the stuff. But like a lot of propaganda is
happening there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it would be worth studying as well. Yeah, wasn't data that we collected at that point, but yeah, it sounds very valuable to look at, definitely. Yeah. I see. Yeah, it definitely sounds relevant to collect as well. At the time, so we did this collection about 2 years ago. And so these were the platforms that we took at the time. We focused more on kind of social media style, but certainly that's not the only data. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we didn't do here that would have been nice, like we pulled what these outlets posted on social media, but we didn't look at the article text themselves of like what were the articles that they were posting. So that's just sort of like a limitation that we didn't get to. Yeah. Okay, so we collect some data, and the sort of question here that we can start with is what might we want to study in this data? And for the previous project, we drew this from existing social theory. We could do that here as well. But if we just sort of think broadly, like what were we interested in? We're probably interested in what kind of information manipulation strategies different actors might be using in these events. We probably want to know if they're effective. Maybe we want to know how they change over time. I'm sure we could come up with a lot of different research questions that we want to ask here. But some of the challenges in this work is that this is like an emerging social media data set, or at least was at the time. We don't really know exactly what strategies might occur here. We don't know how they manifest. We don't really have a lot of information about what's going on at these events. We're also not starting with sort of like in-domain annotated data. We don't have some existing data set of like this has been labeled as manipulative and not, or whatever kind of categories we think might make sense to look at here. So a lot of our questions in this space, they're really open-ended and exploratory. We don't know exactly what we're looking for. What we actually want is just to be able to discover patterns directly from the data. We want to be able to just like look at this data and say, what is interesting here? Where are the patterns? Where do we see sort of various correlations? Okay, so there are some methods to be able to do this. And the most common method that people use for this kind of task is called topic modeling. And maybe some of you have seen it before. But what topic modeling is this way, it's sort of an approach to clustering, but it's an unsupervised way of identifying patterns in text. And this is an example of the what is the still at this point the most popular topic model, which is called LDA, latent data allocation. And under this model, what the assumption is that each document contains some mixture of topics. So any kind of document, or you could say social media post, is not just about one thing. It can be about multiple things. Some of them are kind of more prominent than others. And then each topic uses some mixture of vocabulary words. So if a document is about some topic, it's more likely to have some words in that document than other words. And our goal in making these assumptions is we assume that like this is kind of how we can represent the data as this mixture of topics and this mixture over our vocabulary. And what we want to do is, given some data set that we don't necessarily know very much about, we want to automatically recover those topic and vocabulary distributions from the data. So this is the actual kind of statistical model behind LDA. You make this, do you have a question?
So the questions will be, are those treated just as individual words? Or do you have an opportunity to, like, as an information retrieval, you can use this word as a unit and not utilize any other things? But is there an opportunity for this model to get relation between words, or look at pairs of words, or is it just, are we assuming that each word is independent of others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the original LDA model uses a bag of words approach. So it assumes that each words are just kind of independent. You're not looking at pairs of words. Words that tend to co-occur together will probably end up in the same topic. And so, but that's not necessarily, that's words that co-occur in the same document, not like a phrase together. Some of the newer topic models, and I'm just basically going to show you like kind of the names of some of them. Some of them do incorporate more word ordering. And so they like do things like concatenate contextualized embeddings, where you're taking the whole document and you're making to embedding where word order actually does matter. But the original model is not doing that.
I want to observe, is there a specific part of, and it probably wouldn't be more on probability levels that I would see if I were to on that document to be considered a topic, but can you kind of vary the weights and probabilities that would be enough of the topic?
Yeah, so in the most people commonly use LDA is the user specifies the number of topics, and people often run models with a couple of different topics, numbers of topics, to kind of see how that changes. There are versions of the model where you don't provide the number and you try to get the model to learn what is the optimal number of topics. But in practice, most people don't use those kind of approaches. They just like, what does 30 topics look like? What does 50 topics look like? And see what they think kind of gives them the most useful information out of the data, which is like maybe not the most principled, but yeah, is what kind of people commonly do. There more questions here? Okay. So this is a kind of generative story behind LDA. This is a statistical model. So the way that this model works is we assume that this is the process that was used to create our data set. And this is totally fake, right? This is not how you write documents, but we assume hypothetically this is how we generated the data. And then based on this assumption, we can kind of estimate the parameters that we care about. What are the topics here, and what are the vocabulary distributions for each topic? So the process that we assume, just checking time, is for each topic, we're going to draw some distribution over a vocabulary. So each topic is some distribution over the vocabulary. That's how we define a topic. And then for each document, we draw some distribution over topics. For each word in the document, we draw a topic assignment for that word out of this distribution over topics. And then for that topic, so I'm here now. So then for that topic, we draw the actual word token itself from the distribution over the vocabulary that corresponds to that topic. I just want to give you like, that's probably a little bit confusing, but I want to just give you a little bit of an overview of like what's actually happening here, that this is a statistical model. We assume there's some kind of generative process we use to create the data set. And now that what the actual model does is estimate the parameters of that process. So there's two parameters that we actually really kind of care about here. So the first is the distribution over the vocabulary for each topic. So this is, again, how we're defining topics. We're just learning them from the data. And then the second is the distribution over topics for each document. So each document in our corpus, we want to be able to say which topic, what topics are prominent in this document. So this is the original model. This is LDA that I just described. This came out in 2003. It's still very popular, like less popular on the NLP side, still popular on the social science side. Since then, there's been a ton of work building on this initial model. So there's a lot of variants that make changes to kind of like this generative story, trying to relax some of the assumptions that you have to make here that are sort of simple and not real. But in like more recent years, we're also seeing more of a shift towards doing topic modeling with neural models. So in 2017, this was one of the early models to do this. This was a paper that proposed, this prod LDA paper that proposed a way of effectively like very similar to the original LDA model, but doing this estimation using like a neural network to actually learn the parameters that you want to learn. Now, even more recently, we're getting into the era of pre-trained language models. And so there's been some work that has integrated those models with topic modeling. So taking this kind of original LDA model, but to your question earlier, now you can concatenate embeddings from a pre-trained language model like BERT to your data. And so you're injecting some kind of information about word order. Now, still again, we have more variants of kind of embedding-based topic modeling. So BERT topic is probably one of the ones I most commonly see used now. And this is sort of, this actually changes the, this is a topic model that's about kind of discovering groups of themes among documents, but it doesn't really follow the standard LDA approach. Like these ones are really just kind of building on LDA. This one is actually a bit like a little bit of a divergent. They're doing like embedding clustering. So it's interesting, again, like integrating pre-trained language models. And then finally this year, so this paper, technically not quite out yet, will be out next week, but this is topic modeling using GPT. So here again, they're not really trying to follow the classic LDA paradigm, but they are trying to sort of automatically learn topics from the data and make groupings of documents and learn what's in the data. Yeah. So I'm going to show you some results from this model over the data set that we were talking about earlier. I haven't tried using this one. It seems cool. Seems like I think it's kind of expensive in terms of API calls. They try to propose some ways around that, but yeah, this seems kind of interesting. I think it's really nice to see these sort of approaches that are not just like, how do we do a better LDA, but how do we get to this goal of learning things from our data using sort of like newer methods. Okay. So this, let me skip over this one, and let me get to some of the results. So this is the output of a contextualized topic model over the data set that I described earlier. So this is social media posts made by state-affiliated or independent news outlets in Russia. And this is we set the number of topics here to be 30 topics. I'm not showing you all 30 because you can't read that much. And then the coloring here indicates like is the average proportion of this topic in each document in each of these two different corpora. So if this like independent bar is higher, that means the topic was more prevalent in the independent news outlets. So this is like kind of hard to read, right? Like it's pretty hard to get anything out of this chart. We can stare at it, like I will point out a couple of things, but so one of the ones that I think is kind of interesting here, there's like this sort of topic that is found that is kind of related to sports. It has these like games and team terms, and that's more common in the state affiliated posts. Do you have a question?
Yeah, but there was the topic that the Russian sports match would be banned from Olympics, so it's like not really relevant to the board.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is like talking about sports is a very classic like distraction strategy. That's like how do you the I don't know, like ancient example of this is like in ancient Rome, like the gladiator games were meant to like distract like the people from like caring about politics, right? So I wouldn't like quite necessarily. It's maybe what's happening here, yeah, like that there's some kind of evidence of when we talk about things like sports that keeps people's attention and like distracts from other kind of politics that we might not want them to pay attention to. One of the other ones that I think is interesting here, so there's two topics that seem like a little bit more kind of war and Ukraine related. And what's really weird is that under the topic model, they're more prevalent in the state affiliated outlets, which is not what we would expect. Like all of the kind of,
Title them, or what does the title mean? Or are
Mhm. Yeah, these are the three most probable words under each topic. You have a question?
Clarify the data set that you were operating on. You said that you didn't include the actual text of articles written by all of the various media outlets. So is this just about tweets that the state affiliated or independent outlets posted?
Yeah, so these are social media posts made by these outlets. I think this one is this one is the VK data. I don't think the Twitter data is on this chart. And so in practice, these posts are usually like a short description of an article and a link to the article. Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of weird, right? We don't expect to find more references to war and military in the state affiliated outlets. And this actually, like, we can tell that this is wrong because if we just count how often outlets use the word war, we find a much higher prevalence in the independent outlets. And you particularly, like, this is once the war started, you see this like big divergence between how frequently it's used. So if we actually go through and just count the words, like this is not what we find, right? So what's actually happening here, if we dig a little bit deeper into this topic, it seems like it's actually explicitly capturing the state-affiliated narrative of the war. It's using the words that like the Russian government used to talk about the war rather than just like more general terms. So this is some of the dangers of topic modeling. Why is it useful? Well, it's this exploratory text analysis method that lets us.
Comes up the word war and it shows up more often than the independent media. And then it's the explanation I get you.
Sure. So if we count how often, okay, so yeah, at this time, the state affiliated narrative was that this is not a war, this is a military operation. Whereas independent outlets would use the word war or word invasion. And so if you count in this chart, like how often do they say any of these terms? You know, even taking aside like one uses war, one uses military operation, how often do they use either of those words? You see it's way more common in the independent outlets. But when you look at yeah, so what these topics are potentially capturing is, for example, like how often maybe the word military operation is really probable under this topic, and the word war is not very probable under this topic. So the topic is actually, it's not capturing just generally how much are they talking about the war, it's how much are they using these words that are the state affiliated narrative. Yeah, yeah. So this is I maybe should have put this earlier. Like this is one of the cons of trying to use topic models is it's really difficult to control exactly what they're capturing. Like what we want them to capture is some sort of broad narrative of, you know, of this particular event, but they're actually just going to pick up on sort of specific keywords. And so they might end up capturing something different than we actually really wanted them to. You have a question? Yeah, so it could be, I don't know about these ones particularly. So the question was like, these two topics look really similar. They both have like information in Russian. So why would that be? It's possible that if you look at more than the top 3 words, there's a clear difference. Sometimes topic modeling is just like messy and doesn't, if we set the number of topics too high, then we're going to get like multiple topics that sort of refer to the same thing. The other thing that's happening here, this is all translated into English. The original data is not in English. It's in Russian. So these might actually be different words in Russian. And they just, in the translation, were the same. Yeah. Go ahead.
How do you like generate the data set that you're gonna feed into this model? Because obviously not all these are about the Russian brain work.
Yeah, so here, I mean, what we're pulling is just what were these news outlets posting on social media? So some of the question, like some of what we're trying to answer is, are they talking about the war? So we just feed in all of that.
I think it's natural, different media talk about different things, right? So how do you define concept? Is it more based on not the text, but like what organization you're organizing? Or is there really something in the text that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, how do you define, like, how do you determine what's actually manipulative? And I think so, to what you said, like a lot of times you are working in a situation where you have some outside knowledge about like who the sort of actor might be and what their agenda might be. So here, like we're looking at Russian news. We know that the news is affiliated with the government. We assume that like the government has a lot of control over what these outlets post. And so that's like where we potentially, like we're using some kind of external knowledge about who the actor is. There's been some work that tries to look at more kind of narrower signals and text. So usually starting with data that's like you have some reason to believe there's some kind of manipulation, but they highlight like, highlight like keywords. And so they try to show things like there are some kind of word level differences you can find. Sometimes like more manipulative news tends to be more sensationalized. And so they use more like adjectives and that kind of thing. That line of work is pretty, like it's pretty tough to be confident in anything from there. Yeah, like typically you kind of have to assume that there's some actor that's trying to manipulate the news, and maybe you're trying to learn exactly what their strategies are, but you have to kind of start with some like grounding assumptions. Yeah.
So there's a difference between talking about a topic and the like whether or not there's a positive or negative connotation about that particular topic in the text itself. Did you do any work with sentiment analysis or along those lines regarding each of the topics and whether or not the state affiliated versus independent news outlets approach the same topic through different angles?
Yeah, right. So I don't have that data in these. Oh, so the question was, there's a difference between talking about a topic and like whether you say kind of positive or negative things about it. So what about those level of differences? So in this line of work, typically this typically distinguish between topics and frames. And so topic is like what you are talking about, and a frame is how are you talking about that. I didn't put those results here. In the paper, there is some framing analysis of this data, not focusing as much on sentiment, but more like more looking at policy frames, like what aspects of the topic are each of these focusing on. So we did some of that. It is like there's some framing can be quite interesting because a lot of times it's actually very specific to a corpus that you can say you take like a positive stance or a negative stance. But here, like one of the things we might consider a frame is the difference of the use of the word war or versus military operation. And that's something we might say like the topic is the ongoing conflict and the frame is like what specific words are they using. Yeah. Go ahead.
The fact that the media are different, they have different target groups. like the Russian media write in Russian for Russians and British media in English for English citizens. So I think there are lots of topics that are not comparable for lots of things.
Yeah, there is definitely like more dimensions to explore in this data. Here, like in this chart, we're aggregating across a bunch of outlets, and so there might, be some differences at the individual outlet level, but what we think we're going to be able to capture mostly is the difference between these sort of state-affiliate independent narrative. But yeah, I mean, it would be great to do a kind of finer-grained analysis that's more sort of targeting exactly which outlets might be comparable.
We have about 20 minutes left.
Great. Ethics. Oh, just kidding. I had another example. Okay, I'll go through this one quickly. All right, so the last example that I wanted to give you, so we started with like a directly supervised approach. Then we said maybe we don't always know what we're looking for. We want to discover patterns from the data. There's also been a sort of like really recent work in this area that has tried to leverage, I shouldn't say tried, but leveraging this sort of era of large language models. And we have these like pre-trained representations, and what can we use with those kind of representations to learn about the data? How many people have seen this paper? Oh, okay, like some, but fewer than I thought. Okay, so this is a paper that came out have we talked about word embeddings yet this week? Everyone familiar with word embeddings?
Yesterday was machine translation, so Philip went through the architecture of basic language models.
Cool. Okay. So this was a paper that came out a couple, I don't know, 6 years ago now. I don't remember. Some number of years ago, that looked at like popular word embedding models. So these are like vector representations of words that came out of training neural networks. And what this paper showed was that there are these social biases, and they particularly focused on gender bias in these embeddings. If you take the embedding for the word she, it is more similar to the word like homemaker and librarian, while the embedding for the word he is more similar to like philosopher and doctor and than the examples in the title. So this was like a pretty impactful paper because it showed that these neural models that we train over text data are collecting potential social biases, and these might sort of get perpetuated in places where these models could be used. So I like using this paper as an example of sort of the difference between more like NLP work and more social science work, because I think there's these like two really different reactions to this paper that was really interesting. So on the NLP side, there was like this like, oh no, my models are biased, right? Like we can't deploy models that have bias in them. This is bad. We have to fix them. We have to debias the models. And so this was like, I did a little Google Scholar search for NLP debiasing word embeddings, and this got like over 3,000 results. Like there's so many papers on trying to debias embeddings. On the other hand, on the social science side, like this is actually really useful, right? Like bias is really hard to measure. And if we can get that kind of information out of these sort of pre-trained representations, we can like learn about society. So there's like a lot of work on the social science side, like embedding-based approaches to measuring bias is one of the sort of more common like text analysis methods now, and that's like kind of coming out of this work. Yeah, yeah, it's a nice example, right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm not actually, I have this example because I liked it, but I'm not actually going to talk about word embeddings right now. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about language models, and specifically talk about mass language models. So as a recap, well, hopefully a recap, and if not, that's okay. So mass language models are neural models that we've pre-trained with a word masking objective. So the way that we trained this model to encode some understanding about language is we gave it a sentence, we masked out a word from the input sentence, we just like literally replace it with the word mask, we feed that sentence to the model, and then what we do is we train the model to predict the word that we masked. So in this example, how are mask doing today? And we want the model to predict you. So these are models that we've trained in this way. They're used in a lot of applications, like they're pretty good at classification, and so it's still popular. Like the example, okay, so the emotion classifier model that we started with, the underlying base model for that classifier was a model like this. right? So common examples are like Berta, Roberta. Okay, so when we think about these like analysis-driven goals and how can we leverage these models and use them in creative ways, there was this nice paper that came out I guess 2 years ago now, that had this kind of key observation that the way that we train these mass models is actually allowing us to identify metaphorical language in text. So what I mean by that, so they specifically focused on dehumanizing language. Subsequent work has focused on humanizing language, and you can also kind of adapt this to other settings. But what I mean is you take a sentence like, the children scurried away. And if we mask out the word children and we ask the model to predict, what do you think is like a likely replacement for this masked out token here? Yeah, like mice or something, right? Like you might say like the mice scurried away. So we could call this a dehumanizing language. Like we're using this verb scurry to apply to children, even though that's a verb that we normally use to apply to mice. And we can identify that automatically by masking out these terms, giving the mass sentence to the model and seeing how likely is the model to output mice in this sentence. And if it is likely to output a non-human word, then we can conclude this is probably the example of dehumanizing language. So this is a really cool application because it's not really like what anyone had in mind when they were building these mass language models, but it's directly leveraging exactly how these models were trained. So this example is like a little bit silly, right? Like children scurry away, that's just kind of cute. But we can see that there's cases where dehumanizing language can actually be pretty harmful, particularly when they're used as metaphors for certain groups of people. This paper focused on looking at ways that immigrants are described. And if I give you a sentence like the illegal immigrants scurried over the border, that sounds like way more harmful than the children scurried away, right? Okay, so this was this is showing some results from this paper. The top chart here is what they did this kind of analysis on was US political speeches. So these ones are particularly congressional speeches. They did some analysis of presidential speeches too. And if you look at the speeches in Congress, so first they just look at potential polarization in how these congressional speeches talk about immigration. You have a question?
I think, because I can say, like, for example, people flock to the sea, and usually birds flock somewhere. Is that the thing?
Yeah, so there is some level of like crafting that goes into here. And so identifying like what are the common metaphors that people use to dehumanize certain groups of people. So here they're focusing on immigration. So they specifically looked at like metaphors related to Sorry?
Like rather than
so it's extracted in that you don't necessarily need to define the word, like you don't need to identify the word scurry is indicative of dehumanizing, but you would say like, if we find that mice is, like we define the mice part here, we don't look for this sentence. So this is much easier to do. Like you can sit down and come up with a list of terms that are like harmful metaphors, like we are equating people to vermin. And you can come up with, okay, vermin and rats, and like that's probably enough. And we just look at sentences where those are likely to fill in. So you're still doing some level of handcrafting here, yeah. Right, so they look at overall polarization. Let me show you the dehumanization results. So they use this approach to look at dehumanizing language, and they specifically focus on these kinds of common metaphors that they identify from kind of existing literature. And this chart, so this shows the level of dehumanizing language that they measure in Democratic speeches on this side as compared to Republican speeches on this side. And this looks at 1880 to 1912 versus like the last 20 years. And so you can see that in the earlier time, the level of dehumanizing language they measure was not that different between the two political parties, but in recent times you find more dehumanizing language in speeches made by Republicans.
Relative, right? So it's not absolute.
Yeah, these are relative.
They can even in time go like down on both sides, but they just spread.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of what you see in like the polarization results, that actually both speeches from both parties have become more positive over time, but then they've like started to diverge. And so the divergence is right. So you do actually see that happening in some of the polarization results. I don't think they did a similar chart with dehumanization.
But they said maybe, one big speech,
Mhm.
and now we have like, thousands of speeches, so that might affect the results also, right?
Yeah, I think that's why they aggregate. Like they don't do this like year by year for this result. They just look at like pre and post time to kind of try to control for some of that. But yeah, it is relative.
So it's possible that it's just greater use of metaphorical language generally, right? It seems unlikely because of the difference between Democrats and Republicans.
Ye-
Maybe
Yes.
Other kinds of metaphors.
Yeah, you could see that. But yeah, they are specific, like they're not looking at any metaphors here. They're specifically targeting like vermin and cargo and similar like metaphors. Yeah. So it's like there could be some differences over time. But I think that they do a pretty good job of trying to narrow to sort of this context by focusing on these metaphors and looking at the relative expressions. Yeah. But yeah, it would be good to kind of like baseline against other types of metaphors.
Because I think it's a typical example of how we can use, these results for a political agenda. So we have to be, I think, always very careful about this, like how we interpret the results. And
Yeah, well, I think that's why I actually think the polarization results are pretty interesting because like the sort of narrative, like the kind of common narrative that you would expect is that Republican speeches have gotten more negative over time. But when you actually like a lot of this difference is really driven by Democratic speeches getting more positive over time. Yeah. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to talk about ethics, but I'll do a little bit, and that's okay. All right, so why do I want to spend a few minutes talking about ethics today? Well, when we look at these kind of classic NLP or maybe more generally AI pipelines, we typically have a number of stages in this pipeline. Usually we do some level of collecting data. We need some kind of labels over that data. We build some kind of a model. We get outputs from that model, and then we use those outputs for some other task. And when we look at so not all projects go in this level. Like now, a lot of times we start with the model and then we label model outputs and whatever. But like most projects have some kind of combination of these components. And when we look at this pipeline, it's not always obvious, but it should be obvious that there's like people at all parts of this pipeline, right? When we're taking data, someone made that data. Someone actually built that model. People get affected by that model, and that may or may not be the same people who are actually using the model. And when we think about this context of social media analysis, so I'm not going to run through, wasn't even planning to try to run through all of these examples, but I picked out some of the aspects here that I think come up a lot when you're working with social media data. And sometimes data more generally. But when we think about social media data, so what are some of the things that we might need to consider when we're collecting and analyzing social media data? Mm-hmm. Yeah, like privacy, right? Like, was this shared publicly? Even if it was shared publicly, did the person who posted it know that a researcher was going to come along and collect it? Right. So I think we can kind of summarize this as who actually owns the data. Were we allowed to collect it when we did this kind of collection? And some of that is a little bit from the standpoint of who made the post, but also thinking about at the platform level, like, did we abide by the platform terms of service? We also can think about this from the perspective of the user, and like particularly, this is really becoming really common of more, I'd say about 5 years ago, no one thought about this. It was like social media data is public on the internet. And now there's become a lot more concern over like, just because someone posted their data publicly, that doesn't mean that they wanted a researcher to come and analyze it. one of the questions here that I think there's been a little bit of exploration of that's really interesting is what happens if someone removes their post, right? You have a post on a social media platform, you collected it for research purposes, then the person removed their post, or maybe it was just deleted. Like you go back and look for the tweet later and it's not there anymore. So do you think you should be allowed to do research with that tweet? What's the no argument? Like, why should you not keep a tweet in your data set if it was deleted? Yeah.
And because some aspect do not want that online. And especially not in a research fund.
Yeah. So, right. So like they didn't necessarily consent to the analysis to begin with. They removed their tweet. That probably means that they don't want it out in the world and you kept a copy of it. What's the like for argument? And let's just say the tweet was deleted in general. You don't necessarily know who deleted it. Yeah.
It's not gonna reflect back on the person specifically, and chances are nobody's going to be reading that specific.
Yeah, I'll like maybe broaden that like a little bit more. Like sometimes it's just like logistically difficult. Like you don't, are you going to check every hour of your research study whether any of your data has been deleted? Like that's not practical, right? One of the things yeah, like what about the investment that's already been put into it? I'll offer a couple of circumstances here as well. Like there's sometimes where data is removed not by the user, but by the platform. So you're studying something like hate speech and you find that a tweet contains hate speech. Arguably, like the platform should take that tweet down, but then can you no longer use it as for training a hate speech classifier like that also? Then how do you ever train a hate speech classifier? Yeah, like it depends why it was removed. Like that's part of it too. Yeah. Okay, and then one of the other things that I put here was we also want to think about where we kind of might be introducing biases in the data that we choose. So we talked about this a little bit already in deciding like which platform and which data to collect. But if we only collect data from one platform, like can we conclude anything about society rather than just like people who use that platform? One of the other things that you think gets really challenging in the social media space, and especially on this theme of like democratic discourse, when we think about building models here, if we have a perfectly performing model, there's like a couple of hypotheticals. So you can say that like we might run into ethical issues because like the model is biased, it doesn't perform well, it doesn't, it's encoding some stereotypes, but maybe we actually have a model that's like totally perfect. There's no bias in the model. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have to worry about any ethical issues. So one of the questions that we might want to ask when we're building models in this space is how could they be misused? So if you think about some examples like a model for detecting propaganda or a model for detecting hate speech, how do you think a model like that could be misused? Yeah.
Exactly. To flag certain speech as propaganda, someone who wants to create propaganda can like tailor their propaganda to evade the model.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's not quite what I was thinking of, but yeah, that definitely like you can, someone could take a model like this and use it to help make their content robust to detection. Yeah. I had something a little bit different in mind. Anyone have another one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you could use it maybe to target political opponents, and maybe that's not in a way that like you as a researcher wanted someone to use that model. In the NLP world, so one of the ones I was thinking of here, it's very easy to go from detection to generation. Like you build a model to detect propaganda, it's very easy to kind of adapt that to train a model to generate propaganda, or similarly hate speech. Right, then you run it similarly like censorship, another example of some of these kinds of challenges. And some of the questions that we might want to think about too in these terms of misuse is like who could be affected by this work. So let's say you train a model to detect if a post on social media is likely to be censored by a government that censors social media. Who might get affected by that work? Like you can get someone arrested, right? Like these are things that are technically breaking the law in certain countries, and that's maybe something that you want to think about in working on these kinds of projects. Like how might this get misused?
Like more you dig into these types of data, the more you can affect like the discourse, because if you would say like hate speech detection, you would like start to label words that are not hate speech before hate speech, like the one before the forgot the word with the children. I don't think that's a hate speech word in general, but if you would like start labeling it as like dehumanizing, and you can like kind of move that people would have to like very much more carefully select what they're saying and posting. And I don't know where this is leading, like then you couldn't say anything anymore. You would have to stop posting because you're afraid that someone would label you as dehumanizing at one point.
Yeah, so one of the I think with that is maybe with a post like the children scurried, and you might not really think that that's offensive, but if I like tell you over and over again that that's dehumanizing language, then you're gonna start like thinking that it is. So maybe you're actually kind of like creating, I don't know, things that might otherwise like not have been problematic. Yeah, in general, I think the long-term impact of some of these types of projects can be very difficult to assess. And yeah, it's a challenge.
Practical perspective, if you as a researcher want to create a propaganda detection model, and the way that the model could be misused is it could then be turned into a generation model, is that then, to me, it seems like that goes counter to like a different set of movements, which is open, like access, open source models, open source sort of software and research things.
Yeah.
Is working on more like hairy topics like this arguments against open sourcing models and other similar research.
Yeah, that's I have that on a slide. Yeah. Let me jump ahead to that. So I guess I'll like go through this fast because we're already over time. But what are some of the things that we can do? Well, one of the things you might have noticed in this talk, I didn't show you any actual examples from the data. Why? Because I didn't ask people if I could put their tweets in my presentation. Or at least if you're going to share examples, make sure they're anonymized. This was a paper that took a different approach that I think is kind of interesting. They put examples, but instead of the example, they just put the link to the tweet. So it was like if the person deletes their tweet, it's going to get removed from the PDF as well. The downside of that is they included usernames. So, like different trade-offs here. There has been some work that actually, if we want to do things like work with people who deleted their data, can we ask them if we can do that? And some studies have done this. Like this was a paper that was looking at when people like post misinformation and then correct it, like they take it down, and they did interviews and they reached out to people and they said like, can we put examples of the post that you deleted in our paper? And the people said it was okay, and that was like how they did it. So it's not always practical to do that, but sometimes it is possible to just ask people if you can use their data. The last one that I have, so maybe you might choose not to do certain projects if you think that the risks are too high. And you also might choose not to release particular models or data sets. And this does come at a trade-off, like typically in the NLP and research community, we value open data, we value reproducibility, but it depends on the project, like whether or not reproducibility is actually important for the goals of the project. I would argue this analysis we did of tweets about Black Lives Matter, like, yeah, maybe it would be better if we shared that data and someone else was able to replicate our analysis, but like probably the goal of that paper, like it's not so important that someone was able to get the exact same F1 score that we did with the classifier. Okay, let me just stop there because we're over time. Here's my like little recap slide. I'll just leave it up and we can, I don't know, do we have like a break now, right?
Yeah, we got a
guess, 15 minutes right now. Food back here, and you stick around and give one time? Fantastic. Thanks so much, Leslie.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And-
This was
and you
fun.
stay around also.
Yeah.
So I did try to get Anjali to be on the Democratic Discourse team, but she's on the astronomy team. Dealing with
Yeah.
extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
That's gonna be, the clash of civilizations there is gonna make our current polarization look like peanuts.
It's fun learning new things over the summer. Yeah. I think I can turn this off.
We can communicate with
Okay, wait, what am I using this for? Hey, Andy.
Hi, good morning, folks.
Okay, wait, we're gonna have to turn you down here so that you don't fry the speakers.
Okay.
Okay.
They're like, yeah, I don't know what that. That is so cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, like, nice to meet you.
right, say something about.
Andy, can you say something?
Sure. Good morning. That's all I can say at the moment, extemporaneously.
Okay, is this volume level good?
Works for me.
I was asking the audience.
Ah, good. Can you all hear me?
Okay,
A
so
little too loud. Okay.
Is this better? I'm happy to keep talking until you tell me the
Okay,
volume
we're
is
getting thumbs
appropriate.
up. All right.
Great.
Can somebody in the audience say something and we'll see if Andy can hear you?
no. Yes.
You are not hearing people saying hello, is that correct? Okay, so I will repeat questions from my seat.
Great.
And then we probably want to start this share as well.
Yeah, do you have slides to share?
Yes, I do indeed. Should I go ahead?
Yep.
Okay, give me a sec. Oops, all right, so that, hang on.
So while Andy's setting up, like Anjali, he'll be around all summer. He's on the AI curated democratic discourse team, and he is the chair of the sociology department here at Johns Hopkins, and has written a book on the topic. More than one actually on the topic he'll be talking about today. And he is unfortunately stuck in North Carolina this week, which is why he's coming to us by Zoom.
Yes, and thanks for the opportunity. Can you all hear me okay at this point? Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And the slides are showing correctly.
Yep, everything's good.
Great. Terrific. Well, thank you for accommodating this somewhat emergency family trip back to North Carolina, which is where I've spent most of my career. I wish I were there with you at Homewood. But I am available, as Jason said, throughout the summer, electronically and in person, and really happy to have these conversations with you all as we work on this process. I know that Dr. Field presented a particular set of tools and angles on approaches to NLP for social scientific work, and her work is really terrific. I'm going to do something sort of intentionally very different, which is to say, I want to present some theoretical and problematic questions about democratic discourse, in the hopes that you all, as really smart, really highly useful, highly engaged folks, will be able to take these theoretical ideas and join them in at least a partial kind of technical implementation of how we might understand these on social media. So intentionally, I'm going to be a little bit provocative in the hopes that you all will take that and implement it really nicely. Please feel free to stop me by chat or by voice with any questions along the way, and I will leave some time for questions at the end as well. So I want to start by saying I am a cultural sociologist of democracy. That's how I think about my work, and I use a large set of different kinds of tools in my sociological research. But when I think about the question of what democracy is and how we ought to study it sociologically, one of the important points that I try to make is that democracy should not be understood as essentially a set of technical or legal processes. So when people think democracy, they often think voting, legislation, maybe court processes, maybe they even think social movements and demonstrations. And these are all instances of cultural democratic processes. But I think it's important that we think about democracy in a broader way. And there are some interesting international reasons to think about it in this way. But the core point that I like to use is that democracy is the set of practices that people use to share a polity with people who are different from them. So let's work through some of these ideas. First, when I say practices, I mean something that's fairly specific in the sociological literature. Practices are patterned and or institutionalized shared ways of behaving in societies. So when we say a practice, we can think about certainly voting as a practice. We can also think about the use of, say, Twitter or Threads or Facebook as a practice. We can think about the question of whether one has conversations about religion and politics at the family table as a practice or not. These are shared ways of behaving. And so if you think about like a null hypothesis in which human beings behaved entirely randomly, practices can be identified by thinking about the lumpiness of that social space, by looking for the places where ways of behaving are patterned or lumpy. That is, they're more common in certain ways than in other ways. And in some cases, practices really are institutionalized. So again, I mentioned voting as that's a highly institutionalized practice. Courtroom procedures are highly institutionalized practices. But there are all sorts of other practices that are much less institutionalized and tend to be the products of culture as opposed to the products of formal institutions. So because I think that practices are the key to understanding how culture and society works in general, what I'm arguing about democracy being a social phenomenon, I want us to think about practices in particular as the ways, as the things that we're looking for when we're looking for democracy in society. The next thing I want to call attention to in the definition is the idea of a polity. And a polity is essentially an organized political group, or you can think of it as the political facets of a society. So a polity is the combined group that is represented in democracy, that is organized as a political entity. And so this is the thing that we use democracy to share, right? So we can think about it as the political portions of our social society. And then finally, I want to point out what I think is the most important piece of this is that we use these practices to share a polity with people who are different from us. Indeed, sharing a polity with people who were the same as us would be trivial as a problem, right? If everyone's the same, everyone has the same preferences and principles, same values, there's no problem. There's no need for democracy. So democracy is the tools and practices that we use to share polities with people who are different from us. And we can think about these differences certainly in the sort of standard demographics, right? That differences in race or class, or gender, sexual identity, ethnicity, and so on are important pieces of those differences. But it's really important to recognize that there are other important differences too. Perhaps more important than the demographic differences are questions of differences in values, that is what people think is right and wrong, and differences in experience, that is what people think is possible, where people have been, what people have learned from the diverse backgrounds that they bring to the practices within a polity. And then we have to throw in here, because as scientists of any sort, we have to throw in the fact that there's always idiosyncratic difference, right? There's always the fact that people are simply different from each other, not because of values, not necessarily, not because of experiences or standard demographics, but in some way there's an error term in any understanding of a social phenomenon. And so there's always going to be idiosyncratic difference as well. All right, so if we use this definition as the way to think about democracy sociologically, and then, of course, you can imagine that my argument is the stuff that the political scientists tend to think about, parties, groups, and movements, elections, voting, et cetera. I think each of these is a democratic practice. It's not that I'm arguing that these are not important. It's just that they don't exhaust the actual processes or practices of democracy. And what I want to argue here for our purposes this summer is that engagement on social media is one of those core practices that makes a polity more or less democratic. So it's common for us to think about democratic dysfunction in lots of different ways. Common diagnoses for the dysfunction of our democratic culture are polarization, of course, across big political difference. What we call epistemic closure, which is the idea that following political identity, people select very specifically for forms of information and news. And so they close off the possibility that they will be exposed to disconfirming or disagreeing evidence or ideas. The straightforward question of incivility in civic and political life. And then I think related but different to all of these is the question of misinformation and disinformation. It's common, I think, for people to say, well, look, if people are making political decisions based on bad or incorrect information, those decisions are likely to be bad. And so we need to tackle misinformation and disinformation. And again, while I think each of these is really important, I think we need to try to understand better what's cause and what's moderator and what's effect. Because I suspect actually in particular that the misinformation and disinformation problem is a product of epistemic closure. That is, it's an effect. It's not primarily a cause of polarization, incivility, and other forms of dysfunction. Okay, so if we think about political voice as sort of a goal, right, an opportunity that we think a more democratic society is one in which more people have better opportunities for political voice. What should these things look like? What should political voice be designed to provide? And yes, I think most people would argue that civil discourse is better than uncivil discourse. That is, being kind and polite to one another, listening to others, right? Those are good democratic skills. They're things that we should teach in schools and universities. And there's certainly things that we should try to promote on social media. And one of the questions that I have for you all more technical folks is, are there things that we could do to help nudge people toward more civil discourse on social media? But that said, I think civility needs to be, I don't know, we can call it balanced or cut with another at least equally important value, which is the value of frankness in political voice. That if you can't say what you need to say, you can't say what you believe without being uncivil, then you should go ahead and be uncivil. That is, that frankness, the ability to actually get across an important, even if controversial message, something you truly believe and think is worth bringing up in an environment. If you can do it in a way that is truly frank and also civil, please do that. But if you have to give up civility for frankness, you probably should do that. And I think there are some important ways in which the goal of civility has been used to silence particular groups of people who otherwise deserve voices in the public sphere, but have been shut down as being uncivil. And so I really want to emphasize that frankness is at least as important, probably more so than civility. Another piece of this, you definitely want material that you post, ideas that you post, and when I say you, of course, it's you in the room, but also we want people to be saying things in public that are more accurate, right? We want less false claims out there in the world, and we want more of the claims that are out there in the world to be accurate. And so this is back to that sort of misinformation, disinformation point I was trying to make earlier. But let me just say that at least as important as accuracy is thoroughness, or you can think about thoroughness as contextualization. And so if you take a look even at some of the more cesspoolish areas of social media, Facebook and Twitter and so on, it's true that there are a fair number of simply inaccurate claims out there. But there are far more accurate claims that are misleading, not because of the claim itself being inaccurate, but because of the context or the argument that it is used to to support that argument is disingenuous because an accurate claim is used to imply a poor or incorrect or otherwise misleading argument. And so when we think about things that we want good political voice to be, we certainly do want it to be civil, but we also, at least as importantly, want it to be frank. We want it to be accurate, absolutely, but we also want that accuracy to be placed within an argument and within a context that allows it to be a more thorough and more easily interpretable kind of claim and argument. This is complicated by some stuff we know from good political psychology, and the world of political psychology has demonstrated, I think, almost conclusively that motivated reasoning is the right way to understand how people approach particularly political questions. That is, the basic insight of the motivated reasoning literature is that people learn and make decisions for particular reasons. They're not what we might call Bayesian updaters, simply moving through the world and incorporating data in a neutral way. Rather, anytime people are learning something, anytime they're incorporating new information or new concept, anytime they're reinterpreting information or concepts they already had, and certainly anytime that they're making decisions, whether those decisions are big or small, they're doing that for some kind of reason. That's not to say that the reason why they're doing it is conscious. They may not know that they're making decisions and learning things for key reasons, but nonetheless, the evidence is really strong that people are doing so in a motivated way. So some of those reasons are really straightforward. They may do that because they like to match their friends, because it's more fun to agree with your friends than to disagree with them. Even beyond the question of it being more fun, you may trust your friends. People may trust their friends to have made good decisions and good judgments. And so for various reasons, people incorporate new information and concepts, make decisions in order to match what their friends are thinking. They may do so to avoid cognitive dissonance. That is, it may be that it's hard to hold two different ideas in one's head at the same time that seem contradictory to one another. Now, we know actually that people hold lots of beliefs and ideas that contradict one another. So people don't always avoid cognitive dissonance. But avoiding cognitive dissonance is one of the ways that people seem to try to decide what to learn, essentially. People may learn and make decisions in order to confirm existing biases. If I tend to believe one set of facts or claims, we know confirmation bias is a really strong process in which people interpret new information mainly in ways that tend to confirm their own biases. But, and this is an important but, and here I'm leaving behind, I think, the most canonical form of political psychology, and arguing actually that people can make decisions to redecide. And the sociologist Christian Smith, whom was my colleague here at North Carolina for a long time, presented an idea of what he called SODADs. SODADs are second-order desires about desires. So people don't just have desires, whether that's to match their friends, avoid cognitive dissonance, or confirm bias. People actually want to have some desires more than they want to have other desires. And so people can actually say, look, I would like to expand my mind. I would like to consider ideas that are different. I would like to be challenged. And it turns out that when we actually take people and tell them, we want to challenge you, we want to put you in a different psychological state and let you consider new and different ideas, people are actually pretty good about that. So one of the lessons in political psychology, I think, is that we shouldn't presume that people are across different contexts and across different situations, that people are simply more or less open-minded, but that different situations help people become more and less open-minded. And so if we, again, reaching back out to you all working on social media innovations, if we can think about ways to set up social media environments so they are better at putting people in psychological spaces where they want to expand their minds more than that they want to confirm bias, that actually could be a potentially useful direction for us. And then, yeah, it's true. People could just have a decision that they prefer to be true, to be accurate. But once again, what I want to argue to you is that too is a motivation. It's structured in the brain in a similar way. That and actually we have I'll tell you in a minute about an interesting experimental study that an undergrad and I did this past year that sort of shows this case. But people have to be placed in particular contexts in order to want themselves to be true and accurate. These are not simply straightforwardly everyone wants to be true and accurate. Let me tell you a bit about this study because it's kind of cool. One of the approaches to thinking about misinformation and disinformation online is an approach called pre-bunking. And the reason for pre-bunking is that when we debunk bad information online, many motivated partisans simply dig in their heels more and become more committed to the bad information, not less. And so debunking bad information online can turn out to be actually counterproductive. So the pre-bunking paradigm says, well, what if we were to give people the tools ahead of time to debunk the bad information they might eventually see, so they're less likely to incorporate that bad information into their cognitive approaches to the world. And one of the most popular approaches to pre-bunking is a game called the bad news game. And the bad news game essentially gives people a set of tools for creating misinformation and recognizing it. And then, and some of the early pre-post testing of bad news suggested that people were really good at this, that after exposure to this game, they became much better at identifying fake news online, identifying misinformation online. My student and I decided to test this with an online experimental design in which we used a better attention control than the original study had done. The original study was just pre-post. We decided to use an attention control, which is we took half of the respondents randomly and had them participate in the bad news game. We took the other half of the respondents randomly and had them use a different online intervention called the implicit attitudes test, which has nothing to do with online accuracy, but it's similarly oriented toward a sort of informational game online. And what we found was actually no discernible difference on any of the dimensions between the attention control and the treatment group in this study. And the reason for this, I think, is not that there's anything wrong with the bad news game, but that it's actually doing something different from what its creators think it's doing. It's not actually giving people tools to discern good from bad information. People are actually reasonably good at that when they've set their minds to it to begin with. Rather, by putting them into the context in which they know we're asking them about the reliability of the tweets, rather than say, how much do you like them, or how good does it make you feel, or to what extent does it own the libs, or make your opponents angry. When we've set them in a context in which the task is to identify true and accurate tweets, turns out that they're pretty good at it, regardless of what the intervention along the way was. And so my point here is that that really is the case, that what we're doing is setting them on a path, setting them in a context in which truth and accuracy are the goals that they're trying to achieve. Another really important piece, and again, this is a way that we might think about the psychological content of social media, is the question of hot versus cold cognition. And we think about hot cognition, this is people's quick and emotional responses. They are probably evolutionarily really useful because they are fast, they're automatic, they're emotional. And hot cognition is in reality the way people approach most of the world. Cold cognition is the cognition that we engage in when we have time, we have space, we're interested in addressing multiple different evidentiary backgrounds. And so another way of thinking about what might social media do better would be, what are some ways that social media could help people move into cold cognitive spaces? I know there's been a little bit of work, for example, on Twitter suggesting, could you hold off a little bit before you post or reply? And even, did you want to consider reading the article you just reposted before you repost it? These are maybe a little bit of ways to get people to slow down, but if there are more interesting ways to get people to engage better in cold cognition, that too, I think, could be sort of low-hanging fruit for a social media approach. Okay. I told you that I wanted to kind of problematize the idea that misinformation is our biggest problem. I do think misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, these are problems online, but I think they're mostly problems that come from the polarization and epistemic closure that I mentioned before. But it's become what I would actually call, in technical terms, a fetish. That is, most people, kind of like us, think that most other people make decisions based on information. And therefore, if people are making bad decisions or stupid decisions, it must be that they have bad information to base those decisions upon. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called this the scholastic fallacy. That is the idea that most people in the world behave in the ways that scholars think they should behave. That is, by deriving conclusions from a relatively small set of principles, is simply not true in terms of how actual people actually in the world seem to behave. Many people in the United States are quite perplexed by the fact that about 30% of the electorate doesn't know if they prefer Joe Biden or Donald Trump at this point. And so many of us in the kind of chattering classes in intellectual life, in the media, find this really bizarre, right? The difference is so stark that we can almost understand better the people who are on the other side from us than we can understand the people who think that it's that they haven't figured it out yet, that they just don't know. But the truth is that most people in most of the world don't make decisions in ways that we think they ought to. That is, that's derived from a set of principles built upon a confirmed evidentiary base. I would go so far as to say that most academics don't either, but that's a different question from the question I'm trying to engage here. And so once again, a question to think about in how social media might do better is how might we get social media to speak better to people who are democratic subjects, but who don't make decisions in the way that we imagine they kind of should, or we like to think that we do. Left-wing people, in making the claim about information, tend to say that right-wing people refuse to believe the science, that they take misinformation willingly, and that leads to dangerous behavior, that in some sense they are immoral, that right-wing people don't have moral beliefs, they only have selfishness or self-interest, that they are therefore ignorant to systemic injustice, and that it's really their ideology that drives most of their engagement with evidence. Meanwhile, right-wingers tend to think about left-wingers, that they are thoroughly drawn up in institutional mediation, like they care way too much about institutions, whether those are courts or legislatures or the press, all of which right-wingers have come to call the swamp. Right-wingers tend to think that left-wingers are way too engaged in identity politics. That is, they see authentic voice or truth as being about who the person is who's doing the speaking, instead of some kind of absolute truth, and that they are that left-wingers are deeply inculcated in the deep state or the media, again, in these kinds of institutional mediators. In both cases, these two groups are seeking to build coalitions of symbols and ideas that are based not really on differences of information or even of claim, but rather on differences of emphasis and values. And so that's the part of the argument that I really want to push toward now. These are two photographs that actually my team took during the sort of 2010, 2011 range. And it's interesting, one of them is from a Tea Party rally in North Carolina, and the other is from Occupy Wall Street in New York City. So one is from a right-wing movement, one is from a left-wing movement. The right-winger, the Tea Party, is actually physically on the left here, and she says, "I want an America that my dad remembers." The Occupy Wall Street person says, "This is not the world our parents wanted for us and not the one we want for our kids." So both of these are arguing for a kind of intergenerational justice. Both of them are engaging in a kind of nostalgia about the world that that parents wanted or parents remembered, right? So it's actually impossible, maybe other than the iconography of the American flag on the left, it's actually impossible to take these claims and identify them as being conservative or liberal or right-wing or left-wing claims on their own. The claims become important because of the contexts within which they are set. And so the argument, we have to understand the argument that people are making in public as only being meaningful because of the grounds in which it's set within the context that those grounds work. The shared presumption across the board, though, is this idea of what my colleague and I call the information hypothesis. We get this from the liberal left, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. We get it from the political right, from Tucker Carlson, one of his favorite slogans, facts don't care about your feelings. Here's a left-wing meme that shows two women engaging in quote-unquote research. Vaccine research is a woman in a lab coat using test tubes at a lab bench, and the presumably right-wing woman is doing her anti-vax research on the toilet on her cell phone. Right, so the shared presumption across both left and right is that if the other side had better information, they would agree with us. Again, right, Tucker Carlson saying his analysis is based on the facts, yours is based on the feelings. Moynihan saying that the facts are what actually drive the argument, but opinions are the only thing everyone's allowed to have different ones of. Right, so this is a shared presumption. And again, I want to argue that the evidence from social psychology and political psychology suggests that this is actually not true. And that in trying to work so hard to engage with questions of correct information, we actually miss the opportunity to have better arguments online. And so I want to talk a bit about what better arguments online might look like. I skipped this slide, so let me just talk about it briefly. The information hypothesis has a set of implications. That is that better facts will tend to make for better decisions. That disagreements over policy questions or political questions can be settled by reference to facts that are outside the disagreement. That is that there are facts about climate change that are so totally uncontested that the facts should give us claims not to the existence of climate change, but actually to the policy approaches that are appropriate to it. Similarly with vaccine usage, that the facts about vaccines yield only one argument as to their individual or political decisions about vaccines, that the facts about the 2020 election will be fully sufficient to identify what people should or should not do or think about it. And because of this set of ideas in the information hypothesis, many people engaged in arguments tend to be searching for what we've decided to call a super fact. And a super fact is that one piece of undeniably true information that is totally factual and at the same time demonstrates conclusively and without a doubt that one's opponent is not just incorrect, but morally wrong. The problem is there is no such thing as a super fact. No one ever actually finds one. But the search for superfact distracts people from better argumentation against opponents in the real public sphere. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, information is understood in the information hypothesis to be an object or a product and not the outcome of a process. But even if we look at the history of the concept of information, information is actually a process. It is that which informs. And it became an object or product actually only as the kind of cybernetic revolution of the mid to late 20th century encouraged us to think about information as being data independent from process. That is data that could be carried cybernetically rather than engaged with argumentatively. Similarly to this, it assumes that information is factual, not functional, that it's simply a truth. It's not a truth that does something. and that information is simply content, and that communication of that information is simply the neutral conduit that carries it. None of these things we think are true. When I say we, by the way, a lot of this work is done in collaboration with my colleague, Christian Lundberg, who's a rhetorician, and we're working on a book together on public sphere argumentation. And therefore, the information hypothesis suggests information is both correcting and completing. That is, the right way to respond to a wrong argument is to simply provide correct information, and that will serve to correct and complete an argument. I want to argue instead that we ought to think about a good argument as including much more than just the information. And we think about it, and this is all follows what's called the Toulmin model of argumentation. Those of you who spent time in high school debate or something like that, first of all, I'm really sorry that you did that. But secondly, you'll recognize this. I'm going to use it in a somewhat different way from probably how you used it before. But the evidence of an argument does matter. This is what I've been talking about as information or as facts. Of course, that's a really important part of an argument. But there's a lot more to an argument, and I want to talk about all of these pieces, not so that you will use this as a recipe. And in fact, I think when Toulmin is used in debate settings, it tends to be used mostly as a recipe. I think this is mostly useful for you to sort of identify the parts of opposing arguments and try to find ways that that an alternative argument might make sense. So the main, yes.
Yeah, I just wonder if, since you're switching into this new topic, if people have questions saved up,
that's good.
Maybe this would be a good time for questions and discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What is epistemic closure?
Yeah, sure. So epistemic closure is the situation in which people select into sources of information such that the information that they are exposed to is tends already to confirm what they already thought. So in epistemic means with some relationship to truth or fact. And closure is simply the fact that, or the experience that people are exposed to some stuff and not other stuff. So when we talk in the real world about epistemic closure, we're talking about the fact, for example, that people who are part of the conservative worldview tend to view Fox News or Newsmax. They tend to read, I don't know, the Washington Examiner. They tend to be exposed. They tend to choose sets of exposures that will tend to reinforce their ideas. People on the liberal side of the spectrum do precisely the same things. The reason, honestly, the commercial reason for CNN's significant shift to the left is that people more and more select for news sources they think will be complementary to their ideas. And so epistemic closure describes that phenomenon.
Yeah, so it's related to filter bubble, but it's people doing it to themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you Google for epistemic closure, you'll get a different definition, which may be confusing, which is from philosophers. Other questions? Yeah. Sorry, let me bring you the mic so you can ask directly.
I just have a question about you just developing this structure of the argument based on rhetoric. Wouldn't you consider rhetoric reasoning also a kind of hypothesis of how decisions or actions are made? Or like, what's the difference between this hypothesis and the information hypothesis?
So the difference between the good argument I'm about to suggest and the information hypothesis, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I want to argue basically is that my colleague Lily Mason likes to say, feelings don't care about your facts, right? That what we know about how most people interpret new information and new evidence is in the context of existing emotional and political identities. And so the evidence is pretty good. Ironically, that evidence doesn't work on its own. It only works when it's set within a context in which the meaning is developed. And the mistake that most people make in political argumentation is the mistake of presuming that the evidence speaks for itself, that the facts speak for themselves or the data speak for themselves. And so my suggestion of this structure of a good argument, building on the rhetorical work of Toulmin, is not that evidence doesn't matter, certainly not, but rather that just giving people adequate information is going to turn out to be not sufficient for them to make what we might think of as better decisions, or decisions even better in lines with the values that they hold. Does that help?
You had mentioned earlier about the scholastic fallacy, the belief that people behave like researchers, that they use basic principles and derive their decisions from that. If that's false, what is the alternative? How do people like go about their life then and make decisions if not this way?
Yeah, so there's the obvious and sort of boring answer is different people do it differently. The more interesting answer is that different people and different situations do it differently. So most people are actually quite capable of deriving good principles for action from values that they hold and evidence that they believe. It's not that people can't do that. It's just that most of the time they don't. So a great example is if you look at recycling rates. I don't even know if this is still true. This was true 10 years ago. If you look at recycling rates in cities and counties across the country, you get actually that recycling rates are highly correlated with education. They're not actually correlated with what you might think of as liberal or even environmentalist values. They're correlated with education. And so the reason for that, I think, is that what education actually does is not just provides people with values and evidence. It provides people with the idea that, you actually ought to try to act in concert with the values and evidence that you have. And so in more highly educated places, people are more likely to recycle stuff because they more tightly attach values and evidence to action. Now, this is a particularly interesting point because, I'm glad I'm in North Carolina and you're in Maryland, and so you can't come up and beat me up for this, but recycling actually isn't all that important. It's a little bit, it makes a small difference in a couple of important environmental indicators, but the amount of energy and honestly money and time that people put into recycling stuff could probably be used in better ways if we wanted to make a strong cost benefit analysis. And so I use this example because it's a case in which it's arguably more rational not to bother so much with recycling, but because what education, at least in the U.S. context, does is it teaches people that it's important to build action on top of evidence and values. People turn out to be able to do that. The interesting thing is that most people, almost nobody does that all the time. Some people, everybody does certain things simply out of habit. It's easier, frankly, to just make quick decisions rather than considering all of the implications of them. And some people, in fact, I would argue most people, make decisions based on emotional states more than they make them based on sort of cold calculation of evidence and value. And so my argument is that we can actually, what I should say is this is a conjecture. It's a conjecture based on political psychology and based on some of what we know from public opinion research, but I wouldn't want to claim that this is definitive. My conjecture is that changing the emotional environments in which people are operating can make them more and less willing to use evidence and consider their values in making decisions. And there's a set of claims or hypotheses, I guess, I would want to pursue on the question of what those emotional states might be and how we might create fertile emotional environments that tend to produce more value and evidence and less the kinds of decision makings that we think are probably less good in a social sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Any other questions lingering from the first part of the talk? Great, back to you, Andy.
Okay, great. So I want to build on this basic structure from Toulmin of the relationship between evidence and claims, largely not so that you think of this as a recipe, but rather, although I could imagine it would be pretty cool to actually develop tools that could identify which pieces of a Toulmin style argument are present in which pieces of a social media post. But of course, the relationship between a claim that one is making, that is what you want the listener or the audience to believe, and the evidence you provide, right? That remains the most important piece of any argument. So again, I am not claiming that we should leave behind the problem of evidence or fact. But there's a lot of different pieces here. There are some smaller or not always important things, questions of qualifiers, that is cases in which the claim that you're making actually isn't true, right? That we can think of this as a scope condition for a claim. Backing, it was just simply taking that evidence and further unpacking it. Where did it come from? What are its scope claims? The grounds, that is, why do we believe that this evidence is true? And then one of the good things to do when you're constructing a good argument is to anticipate a rebuttal. That is, who might contest this evidence and why might they contest this evidence? But the most important piece that I want to add to the claim evidence relationship from the Toulmin model is the idea of a warrant. And the reason for this is I think most of our disagreements in American public discourse are actually around the warrant structure of the relationship between a particular claim and the evidence backing that claim. And straightforwardly, like this chart says that the warrant is the underlying beliefs and assumptions that make the claim important. I would actually put it a little differently. This is not wrong, but put it a little differently, which is the warrant is the set of ideas that make the evidence relevant to the claim. So if I want you to believe that we should cut greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by the year 2050, that's a claim that is based on a set of evidence, right? My evidence being the predictions of widespread sea level rise, the immiseration that's likely to result from that. But it is never the case that the evidence straightforwardly and entirely exhausts the claim. If it did, there'd be no need for an argument itself. The warrant structure is the part of the argument in which the speaker tries to convince the audience that the claim actually is warranted, right? Is based on the evidence that's been provided. And I think we pay way too little attention to warrant structures in American public discourse, both in our attempts to make arguments and in our attempts to refute arguments from people we disagree with. And so my advice often to people trying to make better arguments online is that they pay attention to the warrant structure of their opponents. That is, what do their opponents have to assume in order for the evidence they present to support their claim? And that they pay attention to using and making explicit warrants when they are making arguments online, because that prevents those arguments from being less well accepted. Now, the reason for this, again, is that most people enter the public sphere in one way or another, engaged in political identities before they listen to an argument. It's not like we're addressing an audience full of people completely naive to political questions. We're addressing we're addressing people who are already saturated with lots of kinds of political messages. And all of these political messages encourage people to think that they're better people because they build on these messages. We wrote, actually, I'm not going to go through it now because it takes a really long time, but we wrote for the book an extended analysis or comparison rhetorically between the argument presented on the left, that is we believe Black Lives Matter, no human is illegal, love is love, women's rights are human rights, science is real, water is life, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And the claim on the right, that is make America great again. In the Toulmin universe, these are both arguments, but they are not arguments in the way that we would think about like a formal syllogism, premise one, premise two, and conclusion. They make arguments because they draw upon who people already think they are and what they think they can find out there in the political culture. And I should say that sometimes these things morph. The yard sign version has lots of different examples we've found out in the field. This was just another one that I happened to find, and that particularly identifies the identity piece of this. In this home, we know is very different from we believe. And so these are different claims about who we are as people who subscribe to one or another of these political identities. The reason for this, we think, is a term that comes from psychoanalysis, which is repressive desublimation. There's no particular reason you need to know that particular term, but the idea is that people take pleasure in opposition, right? They like the fact that they've made someone else angry, and people actually have said straightforwardly that if I've made the right people angry, it suggests I've done a good job. That people take identity in opposition, like who they are is they are not the other people. And then the interesting thing about this is that political actors often find themselves defined by their opponents' caricatures of them. And this is really interesting, that often we as political people end up defending stuff we actually might not believe because we want to defend people like us. And so we end up being more like what our opponents think we are than we probably even want to be ourselves. All right, so how do we think about evidence moving beyond the information hypothesis and through the Toulmin method? How do we think about evidence then in this context? One is to think that of all evidence as being a partial claim to truth in the service of an argument. So we can think about evidence maybe a little bit more like evidence in a courtroom than we might think of as evidence in a laboratory. Evidence constrains and enables argument. There's some arguments you just can't make in the presence of good evidence, but it does not ever determine it. The argument has to be made separately from the evidence it's based on. And therefore, correcting misinformation on its own is at least futile, maybe counterproductive, and here's the little twist I'm going to throw in. It's politically totalitarian as well. That is, it presumes that everyone would think the same thing if only they had the same information. But if we think back to that very early slide about democracy as a set of practices we use to share a polity with people who are different from us, the idea that everyone would have the same idea, the same beliefs, if the facts were the same, actually undermines the idea that people really are different. And that democracy's job is not to make everyone the same, but rather to share practices, to have shared practices, to share a polity with people who are different from us. So here's some approaches to doing this. And I hope these are somewhat more practical than where I've been before. One, ask why the opponent holds her belief. So instead of, you're an idiot, I can't believe you think that, don't you know the facts? Ask why she thinks that. What makes her think that? What evidence is she using? What warrant structure does she think is going on? State why you hold yours. Not, well, of course I think that, I'm smarter than you. What are the evidentiary and warrant structures that support your argument? Listen carefully, both for evidence and for warrants. I happen to like a particular technique, which I think of as setting up goalposts. In the social science world, we think about this as pre-registering hypotheses. But to say ahead of time to an opponent, if I could convince you of the following 3 facts, would that change your position on this? And then they can say no, of course. But if they say yes, if you actually were to convince me that the evidence on climate change is neutrally derived and not ideological, then I would change my opinion on what we should do about climate change. Then you've set the goalposts in a way that make it harder for people to move them once you may have achieved that goal. And so I like this idea of pre-registering hypotheses, or just setting up goalposts as part of an iterative argument with others. And then don't be afraid of argument. The subtitle of our book that we're working on is Argue More, Argue Better. People think of argument as being an unpleasant or a nasty thing, but constructing a good argument and listening better to good arguments is actually a core democratic goal, and something that we should really be valorizing, not leaving behind. Do I want to do this? I'll talk briefly about enthymemes. This is a relatively minor piece of our argument, but I think it's kind of interesting. So formally, an enthymeme is an argument in which one premise is not explicitly stated. Climate change is real, therefore we should engage in climate change mitigation. Misses an important premise, which is that climate change mitigation is a valuable and important way of addressing the reality of climate change. So in formal logic, this comes from Aristotle, an argument is an enthymeme is an argument in which one premise is not explicitly stated. And in formal logic, this is considered a weakness in an argument, right? That what you should do in a good, strong, fully logical argument is you should present all of the premises, and you should build an argument that is watertight, based on only the premises stated within the argument. And sure, that's a great thing. But as I said, nobody actually engages in formal logic in the real world. In effective argumentation in the real world, enthymemes can be really psychologically strong because they keep you from having to state a warrant structure or a premise that might be actually more difficult for you to defend. And so if they make your respondent or your audience imagine what the appropriate premise might be, they've come up with it themselves. It's come out of their imagination, and enthymemes can actually be a really psychologically powerful thing. And they're, I would say, one of the ways that make formally bad arguments effective in real life. Sorry, returning to a couple of our points here, right? So make America great again as a claim in the world contains a number of enthymemes. It contains the unstated premise that America was once great. It makes the unstated premise that America is no longer great. And it includes the unstated premise that it is possible to do things that would make America return to that greatness. I would argue it also contains what's not truly an enthymeme, but at least an unstated claim, which is that the past was better than the future, right? Going back to those two photographs I showed you from 2010, that the sort of emphasis on nostalgia is a really important piece of the rhetoric of MAGA, of Make America Great Again. The sign that I showed you before also contains lots of enthymemes, that is, claims that are unstated, but that go into what it means to believe what amounts to the creed on the sign of the set of different principles, values, and beliefs. All right.
Should we pause for questions again at this point?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me just give you the mic.
Like you listed all the untold assumptions, and there's not a definition of what great means, right? Like it might mean different things to different people.
Absolutely, yes. I would. So that's a weakness in the argument. I don't think it's actually an enthymematic point, because a definition of greatness is not necessary to the formal claim that America was once great and no longer is. But you're absolutely right that it's an unstated and probably highly diverse opinion.
Hi, just to make things clear, can you give some examples of warrant structures, like specific examples, so I can understand better?
Yeah. Okay, let me think of a good one.
Maybe go back to the Toolman slide also.
Sure. All slides are Toolman slides. Sorry. Yeah. So let me think of a good one that might really work well here. So Okay, so here's a good one that actually fits well in the social media world that we might be interested in. The claim is COVID vaccines work, which I think the vast majority of scientifically informed people simply agree with. Okay, and there's good evidence for the idea that COVID vaccines work, right? There's a set of clinical trials. We hold RCTs to be the sort of gold standard for the workingness of medical intervention. And we hold both the peer review process and the FDA approval process to be institutionally important for generating and warranting the claim that vaccines work. But the evidence that we have doesn't in itself support the idea of vaccines working for two reasons. One, we actually don't have the absolute evidence, and you could argue, you could make sort of an almost infinite regress argument, but we don't have the serum the serum antibodies available for every person who has and has not been exposed to a COVID vaccine. And we don't know who's been exposed to what strains of the COVID virus. And so instead, we make a set of claims as bioscientists, a set of claims as to what makes evidence good enough to say that COVID vaccines work. These are partially institutional in character. That is, we believe scientists over non-scientists. We believe FDA processes because they are described well and relatively transparent. We believe randomized controlled trials because we understand the processes that those trials go through in order to try to isolate causality. But all of those are warrants. They're warrant structures. They're reasons why the information we have in the world ought to be used to underscore the idea that vaccines work. And what you'll see, I actually have I can try to find in my notes this really interesting argument in which someone who's probably just an online troll keeps saying, define vaccine for me. And so people say, well, the vaccine's working, you're crazy not to take it. And the person says, define vaccine. And then someone Googles, the word for a vaccine, and he says, well, actually, the COVID vaccine is not a vaccine then, it's this, it's not, it's that, right? So there's a lot of work that the opponent goes through to engage with the warrant structure, that is to engage with why people think the extant evidence supports the claim. The other piece, and this actually gets at the prior question about the definition of great. There's also a question about the definition of work, and actually, I think the FDA and the CDC got in a lot of trouble around the COVID vaccine because what it means for a vaccine to work changed during the course of the vaccine rollouts, and so that introduces a lot of doubt in people who tend to be skeptical to begin with. Right, so the early vaccine rollout said that it mostly prevented infection and prevented spread. It turns out that it prevents some infection, but it really seems to mitigate symptoms. And so the idea of what it means for a vaccine to work is undescribed, right? And so it helps. It certainly helps to describe exactly what you mean for it to work and why that's helpful. But I think something that the implications of the Toulmin structure also are that that you're never going to get to the final spot. You're never going to get to the point where the warrant is absolutely transparent and undebatable. You always have to be thinking about this in terms of what's the next argument going to be, what's the next objection going to be. Does that help with the example of the warrant structure?
Yes. Kevin says yes.
Great. I guess let me just add one more thing about this. I've talked a lot about the arguer and the opponent. Right. So we think about ourselves as making an argument to an opponent, maybe listening well to an opponent, maybe revising an argument or even a position based on what our opponent says. But there's actually a third party in almost every argument. And the third party is the audience. And the cool thing about debates is you can fail completely to convince your opponent, because your opponent is not, and you are not necessarily arguing in good faith. Your goal might be to really push your side, even if you think, you know, the evidence is not as good as you claim. But what you may nevertheless do is get the audience to better understand why you think what you think. And so you may convince audience members, even if you don't convince an opponent. For really controversial debates, one of the things I like as an important outcome is simply that people who disagree understand why they disagree. So, you know, it may be the case that we're never going to come up with broad agreement, for example, on what's going on in Gaza, right? That the differences in value and honestly epistemic closure are so great as to make it impossible to come up with an agreement. But I think that a really useful debate with a good faith audience would let us get to the point that everyone understands why one another think what they think. And I think that in itself is actually a really useful outcome of a good argument.
Thank you. I don't really have a question. I have more of an observation. In your slide, evidence as a meeting ground, you list a few like tips, like ask the opponent why they hold their belief, state why you hold your own, and so on. It's like, I just want to say that this is like a marriage advice. Like it's like identical. This is how you should like act in a relationship whenever you want to resolve any conflict, because then you understand the other side, right?
Yes, I think that's right. No, I would. So our biggest point in the book actually is that most of life is mostly about argument, and we should stop shying away from the idea that it is argument. That most of the things that we're trying to do most of the time with speech is make someone more likely to believe what we believe and less likely to believe what we don't believe. And so therefore, we should think about democratic argument as really just one case or a set of cases of argument in particular. Of argument in general. And so trying to do a better job of both listening and revising in the face of argument and of making better arguments, right? These are not isolated skills to the political or democratic realm. They are skills that are really useful in intellectual life, in business life, in public life, and in private life.
All right, 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, so I did this. All right, so I'm mostly wrapping up at this point, but I wanted to throw some things in here that might be helpful, because I think I've been a little bit esoteric in my work on argumentation so far, and I know that y'all are hoping, and I'm super excited about that work, to implement some of this in the real world. And so I was trying to think about what might make better social media arguments, at least in the short term, in the first order. And one is, of course, that the argument is in some way on topic, right? That it doesn't change the subject, but it is therefore responsive in some way. That is, it listens to or demonstrates in some way that the post paid attention to what came before it. That it responds in some way. I do think that a better argument is always going to be evidence-based. So showing some reason for the claim that it makes and the grounds or evidence that it uses to make that claim. I think better social media arguments, and maybe these are some of the ones we could try to have our tools put forward, are ones that are explicitly warranted. That is, that they explain not just what the evidence is, but why they think the evidence is relevant to the claim being made. And then the explicitness is really helpful, like to really specifically say, what is the claim that I'm trying to make? Because when you make people imagine the claim that you're making or guess the claim that you're making, you actually make it less likely that they will be able or willing to accept that claim, the real claim that you're trying to make. So a lot of the misunderstanding that happens on social media happens because people make arguments without ever saying what the arguments are for. and thereby they prevent the possibility that they will make that argument be attractive. A couple of entomomatic arguments here. This is from Lauren Boebert back in 2021, right around the vaccine happening. She tweets, I woke up with a headache this morning. I took some Tylenol. Now, if everyone else could take some Tylenol too, so mine would start working, that would be great. Now, what's she trying to do here? This is right in the middle of the beginning of the COVID vaccine debates. And what she's trying to do is to make a claim that other people shouldn't have to take a medicine in order for my medicine to work, right? And so everyone should choose whether or not they get vaccinated because it's a personal decision to prevent a personal disease.
The person tweeting here is a U.S. politician, by the way.
Yes, I'm sorry. The person tweeting here is an outspoken right-wing member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so she's trying to make an argument that the mandate that other people get vaccinated is illegitimate because medicine is something that works on one alone. Now, there's a perfectly good argument against this position, right? There are reasons why, there's evidence and warrants why vaccines for communicable diseases are different from anti-inflammatory drugs for headaches. That is, that the vaccines prevent spreading of the communicable disease between subjects, and Tylenol doesn't do anything to people who are around you. And so I try to went through this. So yeah, this is on topic, right? It's a big topic right now when she's talking about should people be required to take vaccines. It's responsive, right? It responds to the environment. It's even evidence-based, right? It's a claim about how drugs work that is actually not incorrect. It's just, as I went back to earlier on, it's accurate. It's just not thorough. It's not contextual in the sense that different drugs work differently. It's poorly warranted, right? She doesn't actually explicitly state why she thinks this is relevant evidence. And once again, it's certainly not explicit. There is no claim, there's no point here where she says, therefore, we should not mandate vaccines. And so in that sense, it's entomomatic, right? It makes her audience imagine what her missing premises are. And because this is such a highly charged, she's such a lightning rod sort of emotional figure on the American right wing, it's really clear that what she's trying to do is make her own people feel better about themselves and make liberals and vaccine people seem stupid in the public sphere. Okay, what's interesting is that in the long amount of debates that follow this on Twitter back in 2021, very few people actually do the work to undermine the warrant. What they do is they say Lauren Boebert is an idiot, Lauren Boebert doesn't understand science, etc. And so they play right back into the idea of the process of the emotional polarization that drives this sort of political divide. Another case, this is from 2016, Dinesh D'Souza, another popular sort of right-wing commentator, says, did you know that Bull Connor, who was the segregationist sheriff in Montgomery, Alabama, in the 60s, the sheriff who unleashed dogs and hoses on civil rights protesters was a Democrat, right? So this is it's on topic. It's in the sense that it's about something people are debating about. It's responsive. It actually responds to the idea that the Democratic Party is the more pro-civil rights at this point. It's evidence-based. It presents actually what is a true fact. But it doesn't get at warrant, and it's not explicit as to how people should interpret this fact. Interestingly enough, this historian Kevin Cruz, who's made a sort of side occupation of arguing with every one of D'Souza's conservative tweets. He says, yes, every historian knows the Democrats were the party of slavery and segregation, so Dinesh D'Souza exposed common knowledge. What's interesting here is that, yes, his post is on topic, and it's responsive, and it's evidence-based. It's not warranted. It doesn't get at the question of why D'Souza's claim, underlying claim, implied claim, is not correct. it plays inside baseball, right? It plays with the sort of emotional opposition to D'Souza without ever explaining why it is that D'Souza's claim is not relevant to the bigger question of whether Democrats should be understood as the more pro-civil rights party in the contemporary scene. All right, I'm going to wrap up there. I'd love for more questions, both now in conversation and later in the summer. Thanks so much for your interest and attention.
All right, happy to toss the mic around some more. Question? Yep. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have another question. I just want to ask, like, I feel like the way you're discussing whether we're using the structure of argument or rhetoric is also a specific understanding of speech, a structure that belongs historically to a particular class or hierarchy of people who understand argument to be that structure. So if we're only looking at every argument through that very specific structure, would we be either missing something or kind of like, yeah, I just thought, is there any specific cultural underlying effect in the very fact that we are only defining speech under that very specific structure?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you for that. Look, I think so. Any experience and any attempt to make an argument is always culturally bound in some way, because it's impossible to think about human behavior without thinking about the ways that it is set within culture. But, and there's a really important but here. The reason I said I don't want you to think about the Toulmin structure as being like a recipe or a fixed claim as to how you should make arguments. I want you to think about this as a way to observe and strategically behave in public arguments. And I think that because of that, it actually is relatively culturally independent. And I'll say that in comparison to what it's really designed to be a refutation to. So if you go to the philosophy department and take a philosophy course in symbolic logic or formal logic, right, you're going to get a set of claims as to what kinds of things are better and worse arguments, independent of who's making them and why they're making them and what they're trying to do. So, you know, in the Aristotle background, right, there's this idea of sorry, I'm forgetting the word, but this idea of premises, and the premises are supposed to simply logically go to the conclusion. But the fact is that not just in different cultures, although culturally different is important, but even to different people in different emotional states with different subcultures and different goals, different logical foundations lead to different conclusions. This is just empirically true. It may not be like it should be true. Maybe the world would be nice if the world worked in an Aristotelian way in which, or a Socratic way in which all premises lead inevitably to shared conclusions, but it's simply not true empirically in the world. And so what the Toulmin approach lets us do is actually find ways to understand the dynamics by which different people in different situations interpret the same information differently, because their warrant structure is different, because their lack of discussion of the warrant structure is different, because their emotional commitment, because of how they relatively address institutional versus observational evidence. These are all, so the Toulmin method gives us the opportunity to sort of characterize these differences in cultural approaches to argument in a way that like a more formalistic kind of Socratic philosophical argument doesn't. So would I say that the Toulmin method doesn't miss anything? No, I certainly would never say that. But I think it is much more culturally independent than the more formal arguments about what makes a good argument.
Andy, I'd like to ask a question. So what's known through experiment about the different effects that different arguments have on different individuals? A lot of what you've been presenting here is kind of an analysis from a third-party reading of existing discourse. But there must be people who do controlled experiments and look at conditions under which people are willing to accept arguments.
Yeah. Yes. So there's two waves of the political psychology literature. I'm going to do my best to summarize it in a really short moment, and we can talk more about it at a different time. But the first wave asks the question you just asked, which is what kinds of evidence or what kinds of inputs do different kinds of people need in order to build different kinds of conclusions? And that's the motivated reasoning literature. Some people seem to be more motivated by emotion. Some people seem to be more motivated by just the desire to be true. A lot of people seem to be motivated by the trying to make it not difficult to be with their friends. Right. So if we can sort of identify what the underlying psychological process is that people are using to build beliefs, then we can try to maybe even manipulate that psychological process, but at least we can understand why it is that different people are gaining different psychological processes. And there are some interventions you can do to try to say, well, my idea is good for selfish reasons and moral reasons and economic reasons, and so let me choose the right argument from my ideas that match what we think is your motivation. So that's the first wave of political psychological research, as I understand it. The next wave, and I'll say the wave that I'm the most involved in and the most interested in, done some writing in myself, is the idea that it's actually not a stable individual that is interpreting new information this way. It's an individual in a particular context. And so there's really good evidence that if you take people who are really not very nice to each other and not really good at deliberating in the real world, and you stick them in a room and you maybe give them a meal and pay them some money and you tell them, what I really want you to do is deliberate, turns out they can do that really, really well. And they can use evidence and ideas in ways that they would never have done out in the world, even if you don't give them any new skills. All you do is tell them, this is your goal, and you give them some incentives to do the goal well. There's also evidence that there's some great evidence in the psychological literature about future orientation, that people who believe that they have a longer future ahead of them are likely to make very different decisions than people who believe that their future is less certain. And this extends to all kinds of questions about income and wealth inequality driving people's willingness to engage in arguments that they might lose and thereby to engage in intellectual humility. So my argument actually would be that we should more understand the psychology literature not as being about what kinds of people are, but rather what kinds of contexts and situations people find themselves in that drives them to be more likely or less likely to consider alternative hypotheses, to listen better to opponents' views. And I think there's actually, this is for a different time, but I think there's a whole bunch of things about our current public sphere that discourage people from doing that make it like losing any one argument is going to be an existential failure, and thereby make it much harder for people to exhibit what we might think of as good deliberative activity.
All right, well, you're convincing me that we should have a team working on creating conditions for better discourse. We're at 12. Andy, thanks so much for an excellent thought-provoking talk. Thanks to Anjali for a similar talk before that. Everybody enjoy some lunch. And in an hour, we'll be back in Malone to do a lab where you'll get to build some argubots that will argue with humans.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. I wish I were there with you. Take care.